They found her at the loading dock at 10 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday night, and the box under her arm was the same size as the ones that had been going missing for 3 weeks. James Hargrove had owned the Hargrove Grand for 19 years, 42 floors of glass and stone rising above the riverfront, 463 rooms, a lobby with marble floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. He had built every floor of it from a single inherited property and 30 years of decisions he had never once regretted. He was not a man who made mistakes about people. He had not been wrong about a member of staff in the entire 19 years he had operated this building. Until tonight. The dock was cold. November had arrived the way November always arrived in this city, without apology, pushing the temperature down in the space of a single afternoon. The fluorescent light above the service entrance was flickering the way it had been flickering for 6 days, and James had asked Gerald Marsh, his deputy operations director, to have it seen to 4 separate times. The light was still flickering. He would deal with that separately. The woman standing at the bottom of the dock steps had not seen him yet. She was slight, perhaps 40, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to move quickly in spaces where movement attracted attention. Her uniform was pressed even at this hour. Her hair was pinned neatly under the small cap every member of the housekeeping staff wore. The box under her arm was a hotel supply box, cardboard, brown, the kind that arrived holding bottles of the French mineral water he stocked in every executive suite. She held it with the easy familiarity of someone who had carried this exact thing out of this exact door many times before. Because she had. Gerald had shown him the footage this afternoon. 14 separate recordings over the past 3 weeks, each one time-stamped between 10:45 and 11:20 in the evening. 14 evenings. 14 boxes. The inventory count had been flagged by the supply team. Gerald had pulled the camera records himself. I'd brought them to James's office with the careful gravity of a man doing something uncomfortable but necessary, and had laid the tablet on the desk without a word. James had watched the footage in silence. He had recognized her immediately. Helen Davies. 4 years on the housekeeping staff. Every annual review marked excellent. Not a single complaint in 4 years. He had not wanted to believe it. That was the honest truth, and James Hargrove was in the end an honest man. He had sat with that footage for 3 hours before deciding he would come down to the dock himself tonight, because he needed to see it with his own eyes before he ended someone's livelihood. That much he owed her. What he had not anticipated was how ordinary it would look. No furtiveness, no hurrying. She walked to the dock with the box as though she had every right in the world to carry it, and perhaps that was the worst part, the absolute absence of guilt in how she moved. He stepped out of the shadow. She saw him at the same moment he spoke, and her face did not change the way he expected it to. There was no flinch, no wide-eyed scramble for an excuse. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they have been waiting for. Mrs. Davies, Mr. Hargrove. He looked at the box. She looked at the box too, and then back at him, and she did not put it down. A had prepared for this conversation. He had rehearsed 3 versions of it in his office before coming down. He began the version he had decided on, a measured, professional set of questions, fide, reasonable, giving her the chance to explain. And he got through the first 2 sentences before Gerald appeared at the top of the dock steps, and everything James had planned became irrelevant. Gerald Marsh was not alone. He had brought 4 members of the evening management team, a security supervisor, and this was the detail James would think about for a long time afterward, the night desk manager who had a notepad as though he had been told to record what happened. None of them had been asked here. James had told no one he was coming to the dock tonight. He had told no one except Gerald, whom he had called 2 hours ago to verify a question about the supply records. Gerald descended the stairs with the particular energy of a man arriving to something he had orchestrated. He was 44, trim, always well-dressed, a man who had been angling for the general manager position for 2 years and who, James now registered in a cold, clarifying way, had recently submitted a proposal to restructure the entire supply chain operation under his own oversight. Caught in the act, Gerald said. It was not addressed to James, it was addressed to the 4 people behind him. To the notepad, to some audience Gerald had already imagined applauding. Helen Davies did not look at Gerald. She kept her eyes on James. James took a breath. Mrs. Davies, can you explain what you're doing with this box? I was taking it home, she said. Hotel property, Gerald said. 14 incidents in 3 weeks. We have it all on camera. Gerald. James held up one hand, keeping his eyes on Helen. I asked her, Mr. Hargrove. Her voice was low and even. It had a steadiness to it that James found despite everything difficult to dismiss. I know how this looks. I've known for some time that it was going to come to this. I've been trying to decide what to say. Say it now, he told her. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone constructing a lie. Something else. Something that looked more like a person choosing which truth to offer. I can't explain tonight, she said. Not here. Not in the way that would make sense. She looked at the people gathered behind Gerald, at their faces, at the notepad. Something moved across her expression, something that had nothing to do with fear. But I want you to know that I have never taken anything from this building that cost you money. Every box I took was empty, destined for the recycling collection. I know that isn't the point. I know that isn't how it looks on a camera. Gerald laughed. It was a short sound designed to signal to the people behind him that this was exactly the kind of excuse you would expect. Empty boxes, he said. 14 times. James watched her. She was looking at Gerald now with an expression he could not name. Not contempt, not anger, but something quieter and more final. As though she had taken a careful measurement of Gerald Marsh and arrived at a precise and settled conclusion about what she was looking at. She turned back to James. You can confiscate every box I ever carried out of here, Mr. Hargrove, she said. Her voice did not rise. She was not performing for the people on the stairs. She was speaking only to him. But the warmth those children slept on last night, that's already given. That belongs to them now, not to this building. The loading dock was very quiet for a moment. Gerald filled the silence. It was efficient about it. It told the security supervisor to log the incident, told the night manager to document the exchange, and told Helen Davies that she was suspended pending formal review, effective immediately. It did it smoothly, professionally, the way a man does something he has rehearsed. Helen listened without moving. She set the box down on the dock step with care, the way you set something down when you want the person watching to understand you're choosing to put it there, not because you have been forced to. She straightened. She met James's eyes one final time. Good night, Mr. Hargrove. She walked past Gerald and the gathered staff without a word, and she walked through the service corridor and out into the cold without looking back. And James stood in the flickering dock light and watched her go, and could not have said, in that moment, what he was feeling. What he was feeling was doubt. He knew what doubt felt like. It had a specific weight, a specific location, somewhere behind the sternum, a pressure that had nothing to do with facts. He had been wrong about people before. Once, badly, in the early years, a trusted financial officer who had been quietly redirecting accounts for 18 months before James had discovered it. After that, he had become careful. After Eleanor died 14 months ago, he had become something more than careful. He would admit this to himself now, standing in the dock with the fluorescent light flickering overhead. He had become a man who found it easier to believe in the worst of people than in anything else, because the worst of people, at least, he could explain. He stood at the dock for a long time after everyone had gone back inside. Then he walked to where she had set the box down and picked it up. It was empty. He didn't call Gerald back. He didn't call the security team. He walked to the side door where the hotel kept its personal vehicles, got into his car, and sat in the driver's seat in the dark for 8 minutes, and then he made a decision that he could not have explained to anyone, including himself, but that felt, for the first time in 14 months, like the right kind of decision. He was going to follow her. Not to call the police. Not to confront her again. He needed to understand what she meant. And he had learned long ago. Eleanor had taught him this. In the particular patient way Eleanor had taught him everything important. That there were certain answers you could only get by seeing them with your own eyes. He started the car. It was 11:34 on a Tuesday night, and the city outside the hotel was doing what cities do, exhaling the last of its business hour energy, settling into the quieter register of the night. The riverfront was still lit, still busy with the restaurants and wine bars that catered to the kind of people who stayed in the hotel. He drove slowly, keeping a distance he hoped was sufficient. She was on foot, carrying nothing, She had left the box, she had walked out with only her coat and her bag, and she walked the way she had stood at the dock, with that particular unhurried steadiness that he was beginning to understand was simply how she moved through the world. It followed her past the financial district, past the glass-fronted buildings, where people like him made the decisions that shaped the lives of people like her, past the restaurants and the theaters and the hotels that competed with his own. The city around him was the city he knew, lit, expensive, navigable, familiar in the way that places are familiar when you have spent a long time near the top of them. Then she turned left onto a road he did not recognize, and the city changed. It changed in the way cities change when you cross certain invisible lines. Not all at once, but gradually, incrementally, each block a degree further from the world he inhabited. The restaurants became takeaways. The glass became brick. The streetlights became fewer and further apart. The quality of the light moving from warm to cold to the particular pale orange of lamps that had not been replaced in years. The pavement changed. He felt it before he saw it. The car moved differently, small adjustments in the steering, and he looked down and saw that the smooth road had given way to something older and less even. Patched in places, potholed in others. It kept the distance. She did not look back. He was aware of his car in a way he had never been aware of it before. A 4-year-old black sedan. Nothing ostentatious, but in this street, in this particular moment, it was the wrong object in the wrong place, as conspicuous as a dinner jacket at a bus stop. A understood something about himself. Driving slowly past the broken-down rows of terraced houses, the yards stacked with the particular accumulation of people who cannot afford to throw anything away. Old washing machines, wood pallets, a bicycle with no wheels. He understood that he had driven through this kind of street before, many times, but he had never arrived at it on purpose. He had never crossed into it because someone had led him here. He had only ever passed through it on the way to somewhere else. She turned right, and then he saw it. He almost drove past. He had been expecting, he did not know exactly what he had been expecting. Not this. Not a building so thoroughly surrendered to its own decay that it barely registered as a building at all. The roof dipped on one side in a long diagonal that suggested years of water damage. One of the upper windows was boarded. The front door had been replaced. Recently, he could see, with a solid new door that stood strangely bright against the rotting frame around it, as though someone had understood that one new door would have to stand in for all the things they could not afford to fix. There was a padlock on the door. She had a key. It parked across the street and cut the engine. The car window was fogged from the cold, and he wiped it clear with the back of his hand, and he sat there in the dark and he watched. She unlocked the door. There was a gap between the door and the frame. The frame was warped, had been warped for years, had never quite sat straight, and light came through it before she pushed it open, thin and pale. The light of a single low-watt bulb somewhere inside. It should have waited in the car. He understood that later, but something moved in him. Not curiosity, something closer to urgency. Some instinct that the answer he had come here for was not going to reach him from this distance. And he got out of the car and crossed the street and stood at the side of the building where the alley ran along the wall. There was a gap between the boards at the ground floor window. He stood at that gap for a long time before he looked through it. What stopped him was the sound. It came before anything else, before the light, before the shapes moving inside the room, before anything his eyes could process. A voice. Small, warm, unmistakably a child's voice. And the voice said, "Helen, you came." He pressed his back against the wall. He heard her answer. A murmur, low and reassuring. The tone of a voice that had learned to be a source of calm for people who needed calm. And then a second child's voice, higher, a girl's voice. Something halfway between a question and a greeting. And then the unmistakable sound of small feet on bare floorboards, running. He leaned to the gap and looked. The room was about the size of his hotel bathroom. One bulb hanging from the ceiling on a cord. 3 makeshift beds. No, not beds. Platforms built from cardboard boxes stacked and layered and covered with folded clothing and what appeared to be curtain fabric. He recognized the boxes. He would have known the font on the side of those boxes in his sleep. They were his mineral water boxes, the same kind she had been carrying out of the dock. They were not stolen. They were not sold. They had been broken down and rebuilt into the shapes of things children needed. A boy 9 or 10 years old was standing near the far wall with his arms around Helen Davis's waist. A girl, younger, perhaps 6, stood beside them with her hand on Helen's coat, as though she needed the contact to be sure it was real. Tucked into the corner, on the largest of the box platforms, a small child was asleep, 2 years old, perhaps less. It was breathing through his mouth in the way children breathe when they have a cold, and he was wrapped in what appeared to be a hotel bathrobe, the Hargrove Grand Crest still visible on the breast pocket. James put his hand against the wall. He needed something to hold. Ellen was kneeling now. She had taken something from her bag, a paper bag, pharmacy paper, and was opening it on the floor in front of the girl. He watched her take a thermometer out of its case, watched her put it gently to the girl's forehead, watched the child hold perfectly still for it, in the way children hold still when they are used to being sick and have learned the procedure. Better, Helen said, favors down. She was hot again this afternoon, the boy said. I gave her the last of the medicine. I brought more. She held it up, and something for Samuel's cough. The boy sat down on the floor beside her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, and the room held a silence that James Hargrove had not encountered in many years. Not peaceful exactly, but deep. Intimate, a silence that existed between people who had spent enough time together in hardship that they no longer needed to fill it with words. There's trouble at work, the boy said. It was not a question. He said it the way someone says something they already know but need to hear confirmed. And James understood, with a clarity that arrived suddenly and all at once, that this boy had known for some time that the trouble was coming, that Helen had prepared him for it. There might be some trouble, she said. Yes, because of the boxes. Yes, the boy was quiet for a moment. He was 9, James thought, and he had the particular gravity of a child who had been required to understand too many adult things too soon. Can you fix it? I'm going to try. She can't come tomorrow, Em, the boy said to the sleeping girl, or perhaps to himself, or to some future version of this conversation he was already rehearsing. She said there's trouble at work, but she'll come back. Aunt Margaret always came back. Helen always comes back too. James Hargrove was not a man who wept easily. He had not wept at Eleanor's funeral, which he had regretted afterward. He had not wept when the doctors told him the diagnosis, or when they told him the prognosis, or when they told him there was nothing more to be done. He had held Eleanor's hand in the hospital room, and he had been dry-eyed and silent because he had not known how to be anything else, and he had lived with that as a kind of failure ever since. It was not dry-eyed now. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, and he stood against the wall of that building in the dark, in the cold, and his chest did something that he could not have described to anyone. A collapsus, a caving, not just emotion but structure, as though something that had been braced inside him for 14 months had finally reached the limit of what it could hold. It turned away from the window. He walked back toward his car the way a man walks when he cannot quite feel his own legs. It reached the car, and he did not get in. He put both hands flat on the roof and bent forward and stood there for a moment. And then he sat down against the wheel arch, and he could not get up. His suit was on the ground. His hands were on his face. The cold of the pavement came through his trousers. He stayed there for 11 minutes. He counted them. It could not have stood up sooner. The drive back to the hotel was the longest he had ever taken. Not in distance. The route was 20 minutes. He had timed it from the moment she turned left off the riverfront. But in what he did with those 20 minutes, he thought about the boy's face, the particular stillness of it. He thought about the boxes stacked into the shapes of beds. He thought about the bathrobe with the Hargrove Grand Crest. He thought about the dignity lines spoken at the dock. He thought about Gerald Marsh arriving with 4 people and a notepad to a conversation that James had told no one about except Gerald. He thought about the supply chain proposal. He was in the hotel parking structure by the time the thought arrived in full. Not a suspicion, a recognition sharp and specific, the kind of thing that announces itself as true the moment it surfaces. Gerald had flagged the inventory discrepancy. Gerald had pulled the camera footage. Gerald had compiled the case against Helen Davis. Gerald had known exactly when James would be at the dock tonight. And Gerald had restructured the supply chain proposal, which James had not yet approved, in a way that would, if signed, move every supply order and every supplier payment through Gerald's own budget line, without secondary oversight. He sat in the parking structure for 4 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called his head of finance. It was past 1 in the morning. Daniel Rowe answered on the third ring, which told James that Daniel, too, had been expecting a call of this kind eventually. People who work closely enough with a man always sense when something is moving wrong, even when they cannot name it. He asked Daniel for the supply account records for the last 18 months. Daniel sent them before James had reached his office. A was at his desk for 3 hours. He did not turn the overhead light on. He worked by the desk lamp Eleanor had given him, the one with the green glass shade that she had found at a Sunday market, and that he had told her was the ugliest thing he had ever seen, and that she had laughed at and put on his desk anyway, and that he had never been able to bring himself to move. By the time the city outside the window was beginning to show the first gray of morning, he had found $412,000 routed through a series of supplier accounts that did not exist, accounts created 8 months ago, shortly after his wife's death, in a period when James Hargrove had been, by any honest assessment, not fully present in the running of his own building. He called his lawyer at 6 in the morning. Gerald Marsh was escorted from the hotel at 9:15 by two members of building security, and James's head of HR, in the lobby, in front of the morning staff who had gathered for the day briefing, in the same open lobby space where Gerald had stood 22 hours earlier and told a room full of witnesses that a woman was caught in the act. 4 police officers met Gerald at the main entrance. Gerald said nothing. He had, James suspected, prepared for this possibility as carefully as he had prepared for everything else. But preparation was not the same as innocence, and the accounts did not lie in the way that people could. James asked for Helen Davies' address. It was told she had not come in that morning. She had been suspended, as per Gerald's last instruction, which no one had yet had the authority or the clarity of mind to countermand. He got her phone number from HR, and he stood at the lobby window and called it, looking out at the river, at the November sky above it, pale and cold and eventually, reluctantly, brightening. She answered on the second ring. He told her everything, not the parts he was comfortable with. All of it. The footage Gerald had shown him. The dock. What he had done after. Where he had driven. What he had stood at the wall and watched through the gap in the boards. He kept his voice even, and he did not spare himself in the telling of it, because he had spent 14 months being less than he owed to the people around him, and he understood now, with the particular clarity of a man who has sat on pavement in a dark street and counted 11 minutes, because he could not stand up, that there was no useful thing left to do with the truth, except say it. There was a long silence when he finished. The children, he said. Oliver and Emma and the baby. Their mother, my sister, she said. Margaret. She died 2 years ago. Illness. She didn't have anything saved. There wasn't anything left. The house they were living in was rented. I couldn't take them in. I live in a single room. So they've been there in that building for 18 months. I've been keeping them fed and warm, and I've been applying for housing, and I've been working for the money to pay the application fees and the legal costs, and I've been... She stopped. I've been managing, she said. You've been more than managing, James said. He heard her breathing. Mrs. Davies, he said. Helen, I would like you to come into the hotel this morning. There are a number of things I need to address with you. Your position, your back pay for the suspension, several other matters. I'd also like to speak to you about something else. Something that I want to put to you properly, with the right documentation, and with the option to refuse if it doesn't suit you. What kind of something? She said. He looked at the river. The morning was arriving reluctantly, the way mornings arrive in November. Not dramatically, just gradually and without ceremony. The dark becoming less dark and then eventually, stubbornly becoming light. I have 19 hotels, he said. 411 staff in this building alone. I have never in 19 years created a formal employee welfare program because I believed, wrongly, I see now, that paying a competitive wage was sufficient. I'd like to create one. I'd like you to direct it. I'd like to offer you the contract today. Not because I owe you something, though I do, but because you already know what people need when they have nothing. And that knowledge is worth more to this company than any qualification I could list on a job description. Silence again. The children, he said. The 3 of them, there is a property I own on the east side of the river. A townhouse. It has been empty for 7 months. I would like to make it available immediately while the housing application is processed, with no conditions attached. It's yours to use. Theirs. He heard her take a breath that he would not characterize for anyone, because it was too private a sound to describe. She arrived at the hotel at 11 that morning. She came through the front entrance, the marble one, not the service door, and James met her in the lobby himself. Mrs. Patricia Holt, who had been the head housekeeper at the Hargrove Grand for 14 years, and who had spent 6 weeks watching Gerald's performance with the expression of a woman who knows exactly what she is, watching but lacks the rank to say it, stood near the reception desk when Helen walked in. And the look on Patricia's face was not a small thing. It was the look of someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had been given, without warning, permission to exhale. James walked Helen to his office. He laid the contract on the desk. He had asked his lawyer to draft it in 3 hours, and it was thorough and it was fair, and it stated a salary that reflected the position's actual weight. It told her she could take as much time as she needed before signing it. He told her there was no pressure and no deadline. She read it carefully. She read it the way someone reads a document when they are not performing carefulness, but actually, genuinely, making sure they understand what they are agreeing to. When she finished, she looked up at him. "The program," she said. "Can I name it?" "Yes. The Margaret Davies Employee Welfare Program," she said. "After my sister." "Yes," he said. "Of course." She signed the contract. They arranged the housing transfer that afternoon, with James's property manager and a solicitor who worked quickly and without fuss. The children were brought to the townhouse on the east side of the river 3 days later by a social worker who had been involved in the housing application and who told James afterward, in a short email, that in 18 years of casework, she had never seen a child touch a radiator the way Oliver touched the radiator in the hallway of that house. Hus placed his hand flat against it slowly, as though checking whether it was real. A week later, James called a meeting of all senior staff from the Hargrove Hotel Group and announced the creation of the Margaret Davies Foundation, a formal charitable trust, endowed from his personal account, funded in part by the restitution order placed against Gerald Marsh as part of the criminal proceedings. The trust's purpose was the identification and emergency housing of children living in substandard or abandoned properties in the city and its surrounding areas. Ellen Davies was named as its director. Patricia Holt sat in the front row of that meeting and wept without any apparent concern for who saw her. Oliver came to the hotel the following Saturday morning, wearing a blue jacket and carrying a drawing he had made, which he presented to James in the lobby with the directness of a person who has decided something and is carrying it out. The drawing showed a building, tall with many windows, and next to it, smaller, another building with a new door. Between the two buildings, a road. "The road is important," Oliver said, "in case you want to come again." James kept the drawing. He put it on his desk beside the green glass lamp. It was still there at the end of the fiscal year. It was still there after that. On the evening of the Foundation's first public event, a dinner held in the hotel ballroom, the same ballroom where Gerald Marsh had announced Helen's suspension to a room full of invited investors 11 months earlier. A candle at the center table guttered suddenly in a draft from somewhere no one could identify, the room's windows all being closed against the December cold. It burned down for a moment, the flame small and fragile, and every person at that table held their breath in the way you hold your breath when something is about to go out. And then the draft settled, and the flame straightened and burned steady and bright. And nobody said anything about it, because some things do not need to be said. If you have ever carried something alone, something heavy, something you didn't know how to explain without sounding like you were asking for pity, if you have ever done the right thing in the dark because there was no one watching, and no version of the right thing that would make you look like anything other than a thief, if you have ever been invisible to the person in power and wondered whether anyone would ever, finally look closely enough to see what was actually there, then you already know what Helen Davies carried out of that building every evening. It had nothing to do with boxes. What the world calls poverty is sometimes only love that has run out of rooms. And what we call theft is sometimes only a person doing, in silence and in secret, what the rest of us were too comfortable to notice needed doing.